What does it mean, Mr. Lim, since you are originally coming from South Korea? The DPRK's declaration very recently about sending all the South Korean nationals back to South Korea and also seize all the storage in the Kaesong industrial zone.
Yes, this is a pretty serious situation. As you know, especially since the May 24 measures, which was another reaction to the Cheonan sinking, South Korea actually has been losing our economic leverage over the North Korea. And the Kaesong was not only just symbolically meaningful, it was almost the only one that we can actually implement our economic leverage over the North Korea. So actually we got the pretty strongest, very strongest card against the this time's that provocation. But at the same time, we're very actually sorry about the people or the businessmen there who invested a lot in that industrial complex.
Mr. Gao.
But and plus,
go ahead, Mr. Lim, Ms. Lim.
Yes, plus and the North Korea's that very unilateral and the prompt reactions. Again, yeah, that's another like very serious provocations for us.
Okay.
Yes,
Mr. Gao here in
situations
Beijing,
actually,
Mr. Gao joining us from New York. This is very important because South Korea declared it wants to shut down the Kaesong industrial zone and move all the South Koreans back home, including the storage. But then DPRK acted very quickly to say, we're going to seize this place and also the storage, and all the South Koreans, you go back home. What do you make of this very fast reactions and counter-reactions between the two Koreas?
Well, I would say the closure of the industrial park is just a chapter in this long story of the nuclearization of DPRK and the recent testing of the so-called hydrogen bomb and the more recent launch of the long-range missile by DPRK. And I would say all these actions by DPRK, including the closure of the industrial zone, add to the tension on the Korean Peninsula, and the stakes are really piling up. And the threat to peace and stability, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but way beyond, is really happening very fast. And I think it's time for the international community to really come up with very resolute reactions to achieve the ultimate goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula.
Ms. Squassoni, we've seen so many countries already acted. For example, the United States Congress just passed a bill about how to punish DPRK, anyone who is related to interactions with DPRK, particularly when it comes to facilities and also nuclear development, might be severely punished. Also from South Korea, we just mentioned, also from Japan as well. But the question is, how many cards do we have, or does the international community have on the hand, in the hand, toward DPRK? Will these cards work?
That's such a great question. North Korea is one of the most isolated regimes in the world. And so, you know, we've been piling on sanctions for years and years, sanctions and UN Security Council resolutions. It doesn't seem to matter to the North Koreans how many resolutions we pile up on them. You know, I think each country has to use what it, you know, the most favorable levers it has. China, I think, still has a few cards to play. After all, I think it's about 70% of North Korea's external trade is with China. So there are some levers, I think, that can still be pressed, but you have to be really careful because, you know, one potential outcome is collapse of that regime, and that opens up a whole new set of problems.
Mr. Gao, how many cards do you think, rather, China has? Many others say China has many cards, 70% of trade and many other things. What do you think, really?
Well, I would say if we look at the past track record, DPRK seems to have the tendency of playing one country against the other and vice versa. and it thrives in the division it has managed to create. Therefore, whatever economic or financial sanctions that the international community wants to put on DPRK, it will require concerted actions of all the major countries. Because if there is any division among the major countries, then it will not work. The bite on DPRK will not be that much. And I would say after repeated nuclear weapon testing and the recent long-range missile testing, it is really high time for the international community to get together, to move on to the same page and deal with this increasing menace by DPRK's nuclear weapon program as quickly as possible.
Mr. Gao, you know, the accusation is that many others believe China has not been on the same page with all the others. Is that true?
There are divisions and differences of opinion. From the Chinese perspective, China wants to do whatever that is necessary to achieve the ultimate goal of denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, but China does not want to see that the economic sanctions take a bite more on the people in DPRK rather than on whoever who are responsible for the nuclear weapon program in DPRK. But that fine line is very difficult to manage because if there is any loophole in the sanction regime against DPRK, then the regime itself will get away and they will continue to pour resources on the nuclear weapon program, which increases the whole stake on the Korean Peninsula. Therefore, I think it really requires greater wisdom, courage, and vision, both on part of China, the United States, and all the other relevant stakeholders to manage to overcome their differences, to see this menace eye to eye so that they can come up with concerted actions. This is no longer a time so we can have the luxury of keeping all the differences while DPRK's nuclear weapon escalates again and again. This is the time to put a full stop to the nuclear weapon menace from DPRK.
Can we put a full stop, though, Mr. Squassoni, and also the wisdom, as Mr. Gao mentioned earlier, about not to leave many loopholes in the sanction regime and in the reactions toward DPRK among all countries involved, so that the reactions that the international community has could eventually work to a certain extent. What do you think are the most critical points here?
Well, I think Mr. Gao made a lot of good points, and unity among the key countries is certainly important. You know, I think back to 2003 when the North Korea pulled out of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and there was resounding silence in the UN Security Council. And a lot of that was because China refused to censure North Korea. We're in a totally different situation today. So I think that China has taken a much more active role. You know, when you look at sanctions, what eventually brought Iran to the table, it was related to oil. It was what Iran made its, hard foreign currency from. So we have to take a good long look at North Korea. Where is it getting some of its hard currency? Is this in all of the illegal smuggling, the trade? Can China do better in terms of export control, border interdiction?
Mrs. Squassoni, the question has becoming from ideological, political, to more technical now when it comes to designing the sanction regimes now. As you said, there's more unity than, let's just say, 12 years ago. But how much do we know about the realities on the ground in DPRK among all countries? How much intelligence is being shared? And how much access all the countries have toward DPRK? That when you say we have to make a distinction that we are not punishing the people, but rather punishing the specific acts done related to the country's nuclear weapon development. So how to make sure that balance is done at least to its utmost extent to our knowledge? That is the technical question. I think finger pointing is not working anymore. So how much do we know? Let's just say from the US side, how much do we know?
Well, you know, I don't know for sure, but I can tell you that typically in a country where we don't have any diplomatic representation, you know, our options are limited. I think that South Korea probably and China have better insights. Anyone who's been, you know, in and out of Kaesong may have some insights. You know, we tried really to focus on the elites through all these bans on luxury goods. Some of that helps, right? Some of it helps in terms of Banco Delta Asia, where we restricted money that had been deposited overseas. There are certain of those levers, but you know, when you look at Kaesong, and I think the South Korean contention is that we're going to shut this down because $100 million, you know, that flows through Kaesong is actually going to the nuclear weapons program. It's hard to tell, you know, is that true? How do we prove that? Certainly some of that money can be siphoned off, but it's always a very delicate balance, you know, how much interaction can be helpful and constructive without being siphoned off into the things that we don't want them to do.
Ms. Lim, Ms. Squassoni keep on mentioning South Korea. How much does South Korea know so that we can make that balance at least better?
Of course, but the South, not only just South Korea, again, I mean, I think that the biggest player in this, again, the sanction designing will be, again, the China. The basic, actually, statistic, actually, I think, backing up my observation, again, you mentioned more than 70%, but some, according to some statistic, more than 90%, actually, of the North Korean trade is between, again, with the China, which means, again, the rest, less than 10% is shared by all the other, including South Korea or including any other country. So without the China's more active involvement or engagement in this sanction designing, of course I can see Chinese concerns too, but probably we need to be all together. Again, we need to be more strategic, and as Mr. Gao mentioned, we need a kind of unity or coherent action.
Mr. Gao, I have to come back to you. This is interesting because everybody is saying, well, probably the others know better about North Korea than us. And eventually the ball is kicked to the China's court. And then China say, our judgment is that we want to keep this balance, not to punish people, but only punish the actions related to nuclear weapons development. But then China made its judgment about what that balance is. And the others say, well, maybe the balance is wrong. But where is that wrong? The others say, we don't know. Maybe you just stop everything. And China say, this is difficult, we stop everything because we're going to punish everybody. So it seemed that the same kinds of talk, without much real information, we're having, and we're just having empty discussion. I'm not saying this discussion, but rather, what do we international community know? How can we make that balance? Mr. Gao, your contribution here.
Thank you. I would say, for the record, China has been doing the right thing as far as achieving the ultimate goal of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is concerned. However, whether for the good thing that China and the right thing that the China has been doing, whether that is sufficient to achieve the ultimate goal, that's another question. I think the circumstances on the ground in DPRK are so complicated that the good intentions that China has brought onto the table have been betrayed again and again, and China has been let down in all its good offices, good attempts, etc. Therefore, I think sanctions are one thing, but whether sanctions, even with unity among all the major powers, will be sufficient to achieve the ultimate goal of denuclearization, that's another question that we need to think about. Maybe something more than economic sanctions. And you are right, you know, it would involve, you know, the quality and the amount of the intelligence on the ground in DPRK, but I think it is time for the international community to decide that we can no longer wait. The urgency of the crisis in DPRK in terms of its possessing the nuclear weapons constituting such a threat to all the neighboring countries is real, and any further delay, procrastination on the part of the international community will let the whole international community down. And countries like China itself will become a victim of the nuclear weapon program. Therefore, it's time for real action. But in order to get the actions done, we need to achieve the ultimate level of unity. And in this sense, I think the United States really need to think twice as to how to incentivize everyone to take the right course of action in dealing with the nuclear weapon program in DPRK.